Welcome to the Catholic Table Talk podcast. This is where everything Catholic is on the table. New episodes Thursdays at 9 a.m. Eastern on most podcast platforms. Here's your host, William Sauber.
Welcome back to the show, everyone, here at Catholic Table Talk podcast. We're in the episode 160s, like you have mentioned or have seen. We'll just keep plugging along here, and this year, 2024, at least this is the year when this episode comes out. And this episode we're going to talk about, or we're going to discuss today, is really a lot of you might think of it as a time that you do, or a thing that you do during Lent, right? It's Sacredness of fasting and abstaining. So, of course, we all know the season of Advent, but particularly Lent is very big on fasting and abstaining. But again, the fourth part is the sacredness of it. We should be doing that all year, not just during one season, during one of the church's liturgical seasons. So we have making his Catholic Table Talk debut, Matt Plese. He'll be joining us in just a sec. Before we get to that, though, again, I want to share with you today's sponsor of the show is Dr. George Saguma. Dr. George is a family physician and medical doctor. He practices holistic health and healing at Rapid City, South Dakota. Learn more at drgeorge.com. Thank you for Dr. George Saguma for sponsoring today's show. And also, real quickly, if you have a show topic or a speaker request, direct message us on social media. Also, contact us. Probably the fastest way is catholictt@gmail.com. It's the official email of Catholic Table Talk. Like I said, Matt Plese is the host of A Catholic Life podcast. Visit him at catholiclife.com. Great stuff on there. He's very into, like I said, he's very into the sacredness of fasting and abstaining. And hopefully we kind of clear some things out for you this episode. Hopefully you learn a few things and you start putting them into your practice, into your daily life. And maybe you can pass this on to family and friends as well. So let's welcome into the show for the first time, Matt Plese. So Matt, again, thank you for your time and your willingness and your really thoughtful message to reach out to come on the show.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. I heard about your show on Twitter, and I thought that would be a show I'd like to go on. Glad to see what you're up to and some of the episodes that you've had. So I'm happy to be here.
Awesome. Yeah, I have listened to a little bit of your show, and you have that really great audio radio voice, and it's good to see put that voice to the face. So,
Yes.
so what's the difference between the two? And I guess this is a two-part question for question one, but what's the difference between fasting and abstaining from meat, and where or is that found in the Bible?
Yeah, that's a good question. There is a difference. So a lot of people mix them up. In fact, I heavily, as you mentioned, I heavily promote fasting and abstinence. I believe it is one of the keys we need to rediscover the Catholic faith in our world, to make us holy, to make the church holy, to make reparation for sin. There's just an untold number of reasons I can go on about why fasting and abstaining are so important. And that's why I lead online communities about it. I teach classes in it. I've written the book, The Definitive Guide to Catholic Fasting and Abstinence. It's now in its second edition. I also have it in English and Spanish and even Polish, maybe other editions coming out too. So this is really a very important work of mine because I think it's so under talked about and it needs to be understood because it's very misunderstood. And one of your first questions really gets at that point because a lot of people say, I fast on Fridays, but they actually mean they abstain on Fridays.
Sure.
So fasting and abstinence are definitely different. They're often practiced, at least historically, at the same time. But when we're talking about abstinence or abstaining, and we're talking about fasting, those are really different things. So that's important that initially off the bat, people just understand that when you use that, it has a very precise, meaning. Then, as with anything with theology, you definitely want, very exact meanings to what you say. So, what does fasting mean? So, fasting refers to generally how much we eat. It really means taking only one meal during a calendar day. The meal should be an average size meal, so you're not overeating at that one meal, gorging yourself at a buffet. That would violate the spirit.
Sure.
Fasting generally means that the meals also, and this is historically the case, was always taken later in the day. So the time also mattered when you talked about fasting. And historically, that in the early church, fasting was practiced after sunset. It was just that one meal and
Mm.
that was it. And then over time, over the centuries, it kind of changed. It moved up to 3 o'clock. You'd have your meal at 3 o'clock on a fasting day because that's the time Christ died. By the later Middle Ages, we have noon as the hour. And then also over time, you had some changes. So around the mid 800s, you had the first instance where you could have a second smaller meal. Wasn't actually a meal though. We call that a frustulum technically
Right.
if it's in the morning, or a collation in the evening. And the notion that you could have that morning one actually is only a couple hundred years old, and the evening one is, like I said, it went back to the monks in the mid 800s. So for
Okay.
about 800 years though, fasting was generally one meal, and the time also mattered on it. But I should also say that when we're talking about fasting here, we're not talking about the Eucharistic fast, which is a totally different, separate matter regarding
Right.
not eating or drinking even before Holy Communion. So put that as a side. Some people also talk about fasting; it's lumped in there, but it's really its own total animal. But fasting generally is how much you eat and when you eat it. And abstinence refers in this context to not eating meat.
Right.
So meat is flesh meat of a mammal or of a bird. So you got beef, you have poultry, you have lamb, all those forbidden on abstinence days. Abstinence does not currently prohibit animal byproducts, so things like dairy, like butter, milk, cheese, or eggs. But for a very
Okay.
long time, you couldn't even eat those on a day of abstinence as well. And then there was actually, by the time of St. Thomas Aquinas, he even talks about in the Summa how days of abstinence in Lent are different than other abstinence days. Where if it's a day in Lent and if it was a day of abstinence, that meant no dairy, no eggs, nothing like that at all. It had to be vegan
Oh,
in Lent
okay.
only. And over time, that kind of changed. So if you look at my book, The History of Fasting and Abstinence, this is a history that's virtually unknown. In fact, when I give the book to priests, they say 95% of it is new to them. They have no idea on
Wow.
this history of how what we have now is such a tiny remnant of what the early church used to practice, whether it be with fasting or if it be with abstinence. And even a lot of people are shocked when they read the book too, because fish itself was not allowed for several hundred of years, also on a day
Sure.
of abstinence. You could not have fish probably until about the 6th century, around the time of St. Gregory the Great, when he was Pope. So that's generally what we mean by fasting and abstinence. So totally different things, but they're usually practiced on the same day because historically, if it was a day of fasting, it was always a day of abstinence. There
Sure.
was no such thing as it's a fasting day, but you can have meat. That for over 1700 years did not exist. The notion of there were some days you could have meat, but fast throughout the day started in the year 1741, and that was called partial abstinence, and that continued for a couple hundred years until by the middle of the last century it was dropped. But generally speaking, if it's a day of fasting, it was always a day of absence. But if it was a day of absence, it wasn't necessarily a day of fasting, because over time, what we have right now is a remnant of what the early church had, because they would fast and abstain not only all of Lent, but they would do every Wednesday of the entire
Okay.
year, every Friday of the entire year, and in some places every Saturday of the year too. So as a result of that, over time, some of those weekly devotional fasts just got turned into abstinence, and that's why we recognize Friday abstinence is so sacred, and we should always keep that throughout the entire year, not just during Lent. But in the early church, it was always fasting on Fridays too. So that's to answer how they are different. For the other part of your question, where is it in the Bible? Well, fasting, you might say, goes back to the very beginning. Because
Right.
if you think about it, the very first commandment of God to Adam and Eve was he told them to fast from the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in
Right.
Genesis 2, right there. Don't eat this thing. So he's really forcing them. And their failure to fast brought about original sin. So you can say man's failure to keep a fast and his engaging in gluttony of the eating of that forbidden item is what brought about sin in the world. And both of those are tied to the divine laws of fasting and temperance. And like St. Basil the Great, for instance, teaches that fasting goes back to the very beginning of the creation of man. But if you look at other examples, Elijah and Moses, they fasted for 40 days in the Old
Right.
Testament before they saw God. And until the flood, before Noah came out, no human on earth ever ate flesh meat. So that was a gift God gave after the flood. He was the first person to make wine, and he was also the first person to eat meat. And that's also why historically in the church for a long time during Lent, you wouldn't eat any meat at all ever because that was the gift God gave Noah. So we take away those gifts during Lent. And same thing with wine was actually forbidden for a long time too because that was the gift Noah got as well. So you weren't allowed to have wine during Lent in the very very early church too. But then if you look at the New Testament, we have St. John the Baptist, obviously the greatest of the prophets. He was known for his fasting. His followers were characterized by their fasting. Our Lord himself fasted for 40 days, obviously to give us an example. Famously, in Luke 13:3, our Lord says, unless you do penance, you'll likewise perish. He also talks to the apostles once when they can't cast out demons and they ask why, and he casts it out and he says some demons are driven out only by prayer and fasting.
Right.
So this is several times in the Bible, fasting is praised. And what I tell people too, as we look at the purpose of fasting, is obviously if Christ himself, who was sinless, engage in fasting, who is somebody else to try to, exempt themselves from fasting if Christ engaged in fasting? So that's what I like to come to. And obviously, Christ, as is God himself, didn't need to pray, but he prayed and he prayed out loud, and to give you a role model and an example to others. And he did so with his fasting too, so we would follow. So if you think about during Lent with prayer and fasting and almsgiving be so important, you can see that really exemplified in Christ's life. But um, you can obviously see the connection with fasting, and obviously abstinence is practice is part of that, going throughout the Bible.
Right. No, well said. I mean, it definitely goes down the timeline, and I really love how you put the fasting at the beginning of time with Adam and Eve because I mean, it's true. That's what happened, and I never thought of it like that before. So that was a very, very good takeaway. Also, Matt, for people who are wondering why all these changes throughout the years, what's happening, who makes the changes, does the Pope make the change? Does is the voyant in the church? How do those changes happen?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, this is what Dom Guéranger mentions in his liturgical year text, where he mentioned that, and this is what's also mentioned in several older catechisms too, is that the apostles themselves instituted the Lenten fast. They practiced it, they mandated it, and it went back to the very apostles themselves. And same thing with the devotional fasts throughout the week as well.
Okay.
Even the Ember Days are practiced at least as early as 200, but even the sources around that time say they're more ancient. So they could have been
Wow.
practiced by the apostles too. So the apostles themselves legislated it. And what Dom Guéranger says is, he says, our Lord did not institute fasting as a commandment exactly himself, because if he did so, no human being would ever have the power to dispense from it. So he
Mhm.
allowed the apostles to legislate it, so that way they could dispense with it due to man's needs and weakness throughout as time. So obviously, if Christ said everybody must observe fasting on these days, there would be no exception really. But instead, the church can say, as part of her precepts, you must fast and abstain on these days, but you're exempt if your health doesn't allow it for some reason. And the church has always done that, but it's very cautiously that she's done so, and she's always told people if you're exempt from fasting, for instance, on a required day, you should be praying all the more. And you should
Right.
probably be giving more alms. You should be making up. It's not just a day off. You actually have a lot of extra to do because you can't participate in it. So the church legislates that, obviously. So that means, yes, the Pope throughout the centuries can change fasting and abstinence. But if we look at how it was practiced in the very early church, there was even a divergence because not every place in the world had the same days of fasting and abstinence.
Sure.
So if you heard the phrase, when in Rome, do as the Romans do, that actually comes from the practice of fasting because the people in Britain would go to Rome and the Christians who came from Britain did not fast on Saturdays. But when they got to Rome, they're like, everybody's fasting on Saturday. Do we have to do it here or not today? And they were told, well, in Rome, just do whatever the Romans are doing. So that's where the phrase comes from.
Okay.
And it goes to show you there was a divergence in that. So same thing with holy days of obligation. The church says you must go to mass on not just every Sunday, but certain other days throughout the year. There's always been a difference in locality. So different countries, even different dioceses in the same country can have different days. There has historically many other differences. For instance, when the New World was discovered, Native Americans that became Catholic had very different days of fasting and holy days. For instance, they had to do a lot less fasting than the others because the Pope at the time, I think that was Paul III, said that the natives already did so much fasting because they lived such a hard life. He only mandated a few additional days for them. So there is a difference depending on a lot of particulars, and the church does legislate that because she has the power to do so. But of course, this is just setting what the minimum is.
Sure.
The minimum days that one must fast and abstain. People were always encouraged to do more. St. Francis de Sales, who was around the 17th century, said that if you can observe more days, you should. And that's what I basically try to get people to do. I say that if we outlined every day that used to be required or was devotional and highly recommended and put it in a calendar, which I do, and I publish that on the acatholiclife.blogspot.com website every year, and you can download a picture of that. I observe that. And if you did that, you'll see that roughly 1/3 of the year is fasting,
Wow.
and roughly 2/3 of the year are days of abstinence. So if you add it up, there's a lot of days of penance in the year. And most people don't observe any penance whatsoever. So this is
Right.
a great goal to aspire to that maybe you don't want to do everything right away, but you can certainly work up to that. As we're getting closer to Advent, for instance. Advent used to have his own fast of 40 days that started on November 12th and went until Christmas. And certain places dropped it before others. And by the time of the Renaissance, it was basically completely gone, other than St. Charles Borromeo, when the Protestant revolt was happening, was trying to bring it back in Milan. But we lost the Advent fast, and there was actually some vestiges of that even in America. So, for instance, even into the 1800s, Wednesdays and Fridays of Advent were days of fasting and abstinence here in America, and those kind of went away. In fact, it actually was the case until the about the mid early 1800s. All Saturdays in America were days of mandatory abstinence, in addition of
Really?
obviously to all Fridays, but all Saturdays were too. So there were a lot of changes over time, but it goes a lot of the times the church over time has continued to mitigate and reduce days out of maybe more of pastoral reasons. But unfortunately, a lot of people latch on to that. And as
Right.
generations go by, they say, this is not the way I remember it. We only had to do it on these days. But if you look at the history, like I document in my book, you can see how it's unraveled so much, seemingly good intentions brought about the place we're in now, where people just don't want to do penance. So it's important for people who obviously in our world now who want to live an authentic Catholic life, that they feel a responsibility to fast and abstain more days. So traditional days coming up, like all the Advent fast, or even Halloween, which was a required day of fasting and abstinence until the 1950s, would be a
Okay.
great day to add too.
Okay. Very good stuff. I mean, and a lot of priests, or I was trying to say a lot, but I mean, priests do offer that as penance in the confessional too, is they, fast today. And I think a lot of people are saying like, wait, what? You want me to fast today, Father? Um, but yeah, it's very, like you said, it's a third of fasting. It's two-thirds abstaining from meat throughout the year. Um, and again, we do latch onto it. I do want to ask you this quick question, and then we'll get back on track, Matthew, is let's just say Pope Francis says we're gonna go back more to the old days. How would, in your opinion, how would like the Catholic world react to that if we had to have more days of fasting and abstaining after, like you said, we gotten latched onto this kind of not easy, but I mean it's kind of luxury to kind of say
Mhm.
that in the church here.
Unfortunately, I think a lot of people would have an issue with that because we are in
Right.
a state where a lot of people don't even want to go to mass on Sundays. So if people want to throw away the first precept of the church, probably throw away that one. People no longer care about making an Easter communion or going to confession. Obviously, at least once a year, but you should be going more often. And I think that we would find ourselves in the place where people who generally want to live a Catholic life would understand and follow because that's what we have to do. But unfortunately, I think that a lot of people who claim to be Catholic, but we know actually aren't because they don't
Right.
live a Catholic life, that those people would simply keep doing what they're doing now, and that is not living a Catholic life. So we do need to mandate more days of penance, I do believe. And it's just something that it would be better. And I think Pope Benedict XVI mentioned this, that a smaller church in demographic numbers, but actually in higher faith and practice is better than putting these large rosters to say all these countries and places are Catholic, but nobody there actually practices or cares. So that's obviously quite a problem
Right.
when that's the case. So I think that whatever we can do to roll that back and increase those days would certainly be very good.
Awesome. Yeah, and that's what I knew you were kind of leaning towards, but I just want to get that clarification out there. As it just went through my mind. So, do Catholics and whoever wants to practice this, because I mean, there's non-Catholics who are very interested in the Catholic faith.
Mhm.
Um, d- do we receive graces, and I mean, know as penance. So, do we have extra special graces that we receive from God for fasting and abstaining, when we do it?
Yes, so that's a good question, and it's something that I do like to emphasize to people, and that's something that even Dom Guéranger, also he's the author of the Liturgical Year Text, he talked about that, and I mentioned that because there's a trend to encourage a lot of private fasting, perhaps, or maybe if there is encouraging to fasting, it's private fasting and penance,
Right.
and the notion is the church should just keep the bare minimum as required under sin. And Dom Guéranger actually really countered that when he said, well, he spoke of the necessity of private penance for the Christian who's desiring to make progress in the spiritual life. Obviously, if you want to make progress in spiritual life, yes, you do need to do penance, and you should do penance, and you should want to do penance. But in this, as in all spiritual exercises, he says that a private work of devotion like that doesn't have the same merit or the efficacy of one that is done with the company of the whole church and in communion with the church as a public act. And so, for the church as the bride of Christ, communicates this exceptional worth and power to the works of penance done in that unity of the one body. So, obviously, fasting and prayer or almsgiving, if it's done in the state of grace, it does gain merit, even if it's private. Of course, if it's in mortal sin, you don't gain any merit. So
Right.
you should always make sure you're in the state of grace, but yeah, you're not gaining any merit at all if you're in the state of mortal sin. So, assuming you're in the state of grace, you do penance, and your penance is fasting and abstaining. You do some of it privately, and then you do some of it on required days, like year-round Friday abstinence. It's different because the amount of merit or the efficacy is going to be different. So there's something to be said about the church coming together as one, and that's one of I think the most inspiring things you can see during Lent. Where people come out and this is a communal penance, and we care so much to do this. I'm reminded of the story of Garcia Moreno. He was the famous Catholic president of Ecuador who was murdered by the Freemasons in the 1800s. As he left Mass on the steps of his cathedral, and as he died, he wrote, "God does not die in his own blood" on the steps. But he did a lot for the church and for the faith, and he's kind of like the role model of how you can be a Catholic president. So he was the president of Ecuador, and I'm reminded of a story he took because he went to visit some parts of Ecuador on foot or horseback, and it was quite a long day's journey. And he finally got to a camp late in the evening, and it was during a Friday, and some of his men had no more food and they could only find chickens to eat nearby. And Garcia Moreno absolutely forbid anybody to eat them because it was Friday, and he said he would rather starve than to eat those on a forbidden day. So there's something to be said about the power of that if Christ, through his church, commands us not to eat or drink of some things at certain times, that we should be willing to obey that at all cost. And I'm also reminded of in the very, very early church, it was the case that on days of fasting, you could not even have water until you had your meal in the evening. So
Wow.
you would go without water all day. And there's a famous story of Saint Fructos, who was a bishop in Spain, and he was being led to be martyred, and somebody offered him some water before he was executed, and he absolutely refused to take it, saying he would drink his water in heaven because no force on earth would cause him to violate that. And I think anybody would have said he had a reasonable dispensation, and he should
Right.
have, and he could have drank water, but he absolutely refused. So I'm reminded of stories like that to show how important it is to observe fasting and abstinence. But no matter which we do, it is something that in the state of grace can gain us merit, but the merit will differ depending on if it's a day required of us or just a private day.
Gotcha. Okay. And that's really, I mean, that's really good. No, and I mean, again, it's not something that again we should take lightly because it's not. It's something that's again going through the whole church timeline. And I mean, just think of, I mean, saying no to chickens when you're hungry is not an easy thing to do.
Hmm.
I mean, just raising chickens, I used to raise chickens myself, and it's when you have food right there, it doesn't matter. I mean, like Adam and Eve is like, we want to eat this fruit of of the good and evil. You're tempted to it, but that's when again, that's yeah, that's really the goodness that comes forth is nope. And you receive that that grace and that stuff as well. So well said. And this next question, Matt, I want this is kind of personal actually too, because I want to get more insight on this from just myself, but also I think a lot of audience members is when it comes down to fasting, like I mean, Let or Avet, you know it's coming, you know that you're supposed to fast, especially in the required days. Why is it so hard to fast and abstain? Because for me, I can go to work. I can work 7, 8 hours straight. I can skip my lunch. It doesn't phase me. But let's say the season of Lent comes. Now I'm like, dang, now I gotta fast. Is that because it's mental? Is that because it is very hard? What do you say to that?
You know, that's a good a question, but I think that what it gets at is a couple of things. One, it is mental. So obviously the church also mentions that if we're fasting more, we should be praying more. You don't
Right.
just want to have all this extra time and you'll be like, I'm used to eating at noon and I'm not eating today. I'm just going to sit around and wait until I do the next regular thing I do at one, then yeah, you're gonna feel like it's lacking. But when you mix that in other things during that time, especially prayer, which you're supposed to do more of when you fast, then that's obviously going to be a great aid to that, and that's something I would encourage people to do. And then also, it's important to also understand and picture, the why you do this. So we picture our
Right.
Lord fasting, and then through his passion and through everything he had to suffer, and it makes us understand a bit more about how we too can take that, because if Christ can go through everything, and if he would fast when he didn't need to fast, who are we not to do so? So that helps too. But the other thing I'll mention too is it's important to also prepare the body physically
Sure.
for fasting. So there are a lot of physical benefits to fasting, and a lot of that, scientists and researchers study, and a lot of it's in the context of like intermittent fasting now. Um, but a lot of fasting, as we practice it, might be very similar to intermittent fasting, where it has a lot of physical benefits, but
Sure.
also a lot of mental benefits too, and a lot of long-term health benefits. But fasting obviously is a physical thing, it's not just mental. So filling in your day with other things and focusing on the purpose helps. But there's a reason that the church, for a very long time before the serious fast of Lent, had the period of Septuagesima. So Septuagesima, the traditional 2.5 week period before Lent. That's when, we have places celebrating like Carnival, and that's where
Sure.
you get pancakes on Fat Tuesday. Fat Tuesday was the last day of Septuagesima, but the church used this period to remind people Lent's coming. Lent's the hardest fast of all, because not only is it every single day but Sunday fasting. So it's a long stretch. You're only eating traditionally one meal late at night, and the meal is vegan, so it's not like you're even getting dairy or eggs. So the church is continuing to remind people of this, and the church also wanted people to prepare physically. So sometimes during this period, you might be like, well, I don't normally fast on Wednesdays and Fridays. I abstain on Fridays, but maybe I don't fast on these days. I'm going to voluntarily just start practicing now, and I'm going to fast these days to get my body a little used to it. So this kind of a way to work that in. There were actually some localities in the world long ago, I think it was around the time of the Holy Roman Emperor, that actually required some days during that period. But generally speaking, these were just times for us to physically prepare ourselves. So it's important, just like you don't show up to a marathon with no training and expect to finish.
Right.
Lent is very much a marathon in the church. So you have to be ready, and you have to, understand the purpose. So you got several weeks of mental preparation while you're doing it, and then several weeks of physical preparation too. So I think that if you did both, that would help. In my book, I talk about some of that too. So it's not just
Okay.
the history of fasting and abstinence, but also practical things like how do you ease into it? What are some of these other physical benefits? How has the church helped you practice that period? Or also another thing I'll just mention is it's also important to focus on recovering from fasting. So if you do a
Sure.
really serious fast like that too, you might want to prudentially return to eating regular amounts of food slowly. You don't want to just the next day overindulge. You would actually make yourself sick. So it's
Right.
important. So if you're doing a fast, quite serious, that you kind of ease into it. And I talk about some medical studies that have been shown some of the benefits to that. So from a practical perspective, you might, for instance, eat 2 meals a day instead of three immediately after a long fast of 6 to 7 weeks. But it's important that after having disciplined our body and bringing it into subjection, that we can ensure it's well taken care of. Obviously, because it is our duty in life require us to have a body that works and everything. Proper care of the body and soul are important. And then we also want to have another great fast. So every fast should hopefully be better and better out of our whole lives. So every
Right.
Lent a little bit better.
Right. No, well said. And thank you for that. Because, like I said, that's personal. I'm sure a lot of people struggle with that as well out there. And again, yeah, you when especially for me, I mean, again, I don't fast or abstain much during the rest of the year, Matt. I do try to do really good on Lent, but especially Holy Week and then Easter Sunday comes and you get out of the food and you're like, oh, okay, this is way too much. And so again, like you said, ease back into it is a good way of handling it. Um so with that being said, Matt, with you talking about your book, where can people get the book? And just other resources that you have on this topic.
Yeah, so the book, The Definitive Guide to Catholic Fasting and Abstinence, which you can see here, you can get it on Amazon. That's probably the best place to buy it. It's in paperback. I also have a Kindle version of it as well. But it has the whole history of everything I've only could very, very, very briefly touch on today because the history is quite robust. So I would encourage people, if you want to learn more, please check it out. It is really the source of years of research of mine. Because I want people to understand what we've lost, and then I also want people to understand the roadmap on how to restore and rediscover that. The other thing I'll mention besides the book is I do run an online group encouraging people who want to keep some of these extra days of fasting and abstinence. So we have an online community on Telegram where we come together and we share fasting related articles, and a lot of people maybe share recipes or they support each other on days when it's difficult. So if you go to 1peter5.com/fast, there's a link on that page to all these kind of a three-tier system that I talk about in the book about how to do fasting and abstinence, how to ease into these traditional days. But on the link of that page is a direct link to our Telegram group, so people could join us, and then you can get updates too and follow along. Those would be the two things most applicable. And the other last thing I'll mention is that I also do run a lot of the catechism classes at catechismclass.com, where I teach a number of things on the faith on all sorts of topics, from apologetics to church history to all aspects of our Lord's life and the sacraments, for very, very low price classes for really everybody who just wants to learn more about the Catholic faith. So that's catechismclass.com. And if this topic of fasting was of interest to you, this is just one lesson in the course on the precepts of the church. Wow. So we talk about the holy days of obligation, receiving Holy Communion, obviously, during the Easter season. What does that mean? Going to confession at least once a year. What does it mean to follow the church's requirements on marriage? So this is just also one little lesson in that course. So that might be something more people are interested in as well. So check out the book on Amazon. You can take a look at 1peter5.com/fast, scroll down, join our Telegram group, and then check out catechismclass.com if you wanted more robust courses. So you can even get a certificate of completion and some of it too from the organization.
Okay. That almost sounds like another show episode in itself, Matt, when you want to come back on and talk about that.
That would be great.
Yeah, because I mean that sounds very interesting, and I think you would be a great instructor for that. So I would love to have you back on and talk about that sometime.
That'd be
So
great. Thank you.
yeah, absolutely. So and I'll try to put your links in the description box down below of where everyone is listening or viewing this episode. So the link should be down below when the episode is released. Matt Plese, thank you for your time, your dedication to this very very old, very rich, very great topic that is kind of forgotten, I think, in the church today. And hopefully, hopefully we inspires people here to move forward and take up fasting more seriously. So thank you for your time today, Matt.
Well, thanks for having me. Happy to share a little bit of what I know on the topic, and hopefully people who are listening could just try to observe some additional days, because that's what really matters.
Right, absolutely. Matt, please, everyone. So again, check him out at the links down below, and we'll have him back on the show hopefully very soon to talk about his courses. So again, take up fasting, start, and kind of take it in slowly, and then get into it. And then if you're gonna move out for a time, we cover gently, like Matt said, and you'll find true great grace, and you'll find it's really good physical and spiritually, just physically and spiritually. That's what I meant, I should say. So until next time, God willing, stay in the state of grace. By doing that, you should go to the sacraments frequently. And we'll see you next time, God willing, on Catholic Table Talk.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of the Catholic Table Talk podcast, where everything Catholic is on the table. Don't forget to subscribe to Catholic Table Talk on your favorite podcast platform to get new episodes delivered directly to you every Thursday at 9 a.m. Eastern.